I want to move on to this study. We're going to get to another spectrum story in a second, but I want to move on to this very interesting study about how we sing and if that is a predictor of autism. Do people on the spectrum sing differently than people not on the spectrum? What did you think about this study, Nancy?
I thought it was really interesting. The differentiation between how those on the spectrum sing and those who are not on the spectrum sing. I'm trying to look at the two different forms of vocal imitation. It's pitch.
Yes. Absolute pitch and relative pitch.
And
Never heard of these terms before.
Right. I've never heard those terms used before. And they used an example of the nursery rhyme, Mary Had a Little Lamb, and the differences between how those on the spectrum sang this song and those not on the spectrum.
Yeah. And I'm not sure, because I'm not a music person. And like I said, I'd never heard the term absolute pitch and relative pitch. I've certainly heard perfect pitch before. And they're relating this to how we address language. That there are people who can sing Mary Had a Little Lamb, and they're not on pitch the whole time, but they get the gist of it, right? And then there are but if you were to tear it apart and say to them, no, I need you to sing this note on Mary and this note on Had and the Little Lamb, which is really what you do when you're doing an instrument, right? I immediately thought of when my son had to do, he was in a bell choir in grade school. And each person had to not only know their note, but know the timing, and it was specific. This note has to be here, or we don't get the tune. And so for people on the spectrum, it appears that they process the relative pitch, which is catching the tune and being relatively on pitch, or that absolute being able to pick it apart and just be on a note, in the right note, than people who are not on the spectrum, and that this correlates to being able to understand the gist of a language or understanding it if it's taken apart. I thought that was fascinating. I'm not sure that I completely understand it.
Right. I'm not sure that I do either. But as you said, the takeaway is that autistic participants perform better on imitating the structure of the tune, that's the relative pitch, than they did on the exact form, which is the absolute pitch.
And of course, whenever we see these studies, this brings up questions for me that I want to know, if that's the case, does it help our kiddos on the spectrum for them to learn an instrument where they are learning absolute pitch with a song? I know that I had a hard time understanding grammar. I think I had a bad teacher. I didn't really get it. It wasn't until I began learning to speak Spanish. I didn't understand past perfect and all those tenses until I was learning Spanish. And then it helped me to understand the English language better because I was understanding language. I had something to compare it to. I'm wondering if this is the case with our kiddos, what happens when we give them an instrument where they have to get to absolute pitch? But that's not what the study is about. But these are the things that my inquiring mind lays awake at 2:00 in the morning and goes, I wonder if they looked at it that way. But I do think that this is just another piece of information that helps us to understand how an autistic brain functions differently. This is something Temple Grandin has been talking about for a long time, that, you've heard me talk before to kids when parents come up and say, can you please explain autism to our neurotypical child who has a sibling on the spectrum? And the thing that I always say is that it's like one is a Mac and one is a PC. I don't think that anybody should be talking about this one is better than that one. They process things in a different way. But if we give the right apps, both can get there.
Right.
And this might just be another app that people on the spectrum process the sounds of language and musicality in a different way than people who are not on the spectrum. Right. Not better or worse, just different.
Different.
Interesting. Okay.